Grace and peace to you. We begin our devotions today again by lighting a candle. And today it will be the Love Always candle. Although you may be seeing it backwards. So that's Elah Vol. But you know what it says. So we are more than 3 months into this pandemic in the US. We're several weeks into protests surrounding systemic racism. We're a couple months into record unemployment and a difficult economic recession. And it's tough. And we're tired. We're weary. Some of us are in a lot of pain. And we still have a long way to go. The writer of Hebrews encouraged his listeners to run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. When I read that, I think some of us, if not many of us or most of us, we were thinking that this particular race that we're in right now was going to be a sprint. Stay inside for a few weeks, wear masks for a month, let this latest wave of protests wash over us and then dissipate, because that's what they've historically done. Tighten our belts for a few weeks until the economy opens again and we can get to work with a paycheck. When the distance is short, as in a sprint, we can suck it up. We can be resilient. We can endure difficult things because we know it won't last long. So imagine. Maybe you don't have to imagine too hard. But you start running a race and you thought it was going to be a sprint, so you take off out of the blocks going as fast as you can. And then mid-race, you discover you are not in a 100-meter dash. You are in a marathon. What do? Do you keep that same pace? Or do you slow down? Do you keep your head down and just push through? Or do you start reflecting? Do you start thinking about how am I going to refuel with water and carbohydrates? How am I going to make it 26 miles? The strategy changes as the race changes. The early Christians were in a very similar situation. Several communities of Christ followers very much believed that Jesus would return before they died. They thought his return was imminent. They were sprinting toward the finish line, and oh, what a glorious day that would be when he reappeared as he promised. But then something happened. The first disciples began to die off, not from martyrdom, although many were martyred, but they started dying of old age. So mid-race, they decided they had to start reevaluating their expectations. This may not be a sprint. Maybe this is a marathon. And what does that mean? Maybe Jesus isn't coming back tomorrow or next week or even next year. Maybe Jesus isn't coming back in my lifetime. What does that mean for me? What does that mean for my community? What does that mean for my children and grandchildren? What does that mean for our life of faith? The preacher in Hebrews addressed this issue. And yes, Hebrews is considered by some scholars to be a sermon. So the preacher had this to say about this shift in thinking. Listen now as I read to you from the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, starting with verse 1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith, our ancestors received approval. By faith, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. And then jumping ahead to verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed for a time in the land he'd been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, Abraham received power of procreation, even though he was too old and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven and the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. All of these died in faith without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. And there ends the reading. I've heard some people say they'd rather die than live with stay-at-home orders any longer. They're saying that after a handful of weeks. So I have to think, what are a few weeks or a few months compared to the span of a lifetime of 40, 50, 70, 100 years? What does that kind of attitude say? This attitude of, I'd rather die. What does that say about a person's sense of purpose, about their hope or their faith? As people of faith who know the love of Christ, we need to constantly reshift our focus to the long view. We have to look to the horizon, for there's a lot out there that we can't even see yet. We have to look back to before we were born, that great cloud of witnesses that can spur us on to look ahead to that view long after we're gone. What kind of legacy do we want to leave in this very difficult time? Do our lives carry peace, hope, and love in the midst of all this fear and pain and weariness? Do we believe in Jesus yesterday, today, and forever? Well, if we say yes, then there is that faith, as small as a mustard seed, and we can start again. We start again realizing that our foundation is firm. We start again reconnecting with Jesus, who is the center of our lives. Heirs of Abraham, all of you, heirs of Abraham and Sarah, let us run our race with perseverance and keep our eyes on Jesus. Amen.